Good morning. Let's study together in the book of Numbers. Moses wrote this book, and he wrote it after the Exodus from Egypt in 1445 BC. And the purpose of the book is to trace the time and the travel points from the building of the tabernacle at Mount Sinai to the plains of Moab, which are just north and adjacent to the Dead Sea. And the idea of the book is that God's plan for dwelling among his people in a full theocracy is going to be delayed because of the sin of the people, but it's not going to be annulled. The book is laid out in a geographical sense, really, and we start in Numbers 10 at Mount Sinai. And these first chapters 1 through 9, it begins on the Jewish calendar, the first day of the second month of the second year. That is, after they observed the Passover and left Egypt. So, in terms of the development of what we'd call the progress of redemption, Genesis 1 through Exodus 18 gets you to Sinai, and then they're at Sinai 1 year and 1 month, and the time at Sinai, and biblically, is from Exodus 19 to Numbers 10. So that's essentially where we pick up this story. In the first 9 chapters, what you find in Numbers is that God has provided everything necessary for them to worship and fellowship with him, and they had a marching order because they've been now at Sinai and they're ready to go into the land. And the marching order is basically laid out by family association, who was of Jacob's 12 sons plus Joseph's 2 boys. They march according to which was their mother, and there's essentially a listing of the tribes from the oldest down to Benjamin, and then there's special provisions made for Levi. In Numbers 9, there's a shift in information. There's a date that's given to us, the first month of the second year. Important. It's the first observation, first annual Passover in chapter 9, verses 1 through 14. And it's kind of cool because there's some folks here that were unable, some fellow dropped dead on them and they were defiled and they couldn't observe the Passover. So God in his grace instituted a second Passover, which would be a month later. Important notice of how God is on these kinds of things. There are people who are legalists and they feel like everything has to be done. Well, it was prescribed, but then there's an exception. So you have all these rules laid out at pain of death, and then there's, oops, now what? So it's kind of cool to see that, there's life happens, and then you have to adjust and come up with new ideas. And you see that in chapter 9. And also, as we're looking here, in terms of the progress of redemption, if you're going to have a great nation, you also have to have a system of communication. How are you going to communicate to people? And that is developed here in chapter 9 and 10. So they now have a means of communication, a way of getting the information out. There's a date in chapter 10, verse 11. It's unfortunate that we have a chapter break there. It's the 20th day of the second month of the second year, and they begin their march towards Kadesh Barnea. And Kadesh Barnea is one of the most southern areas, probably the most southern city town in Israel, and it's the first entry point for coming into the promised land. And this section goes from Numbers 10 verse 11 all the way through chapter 19. And so you go from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea in chapters 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. And also during this section of Numbers 11, you have God adding 70 elders to help administrate the congregation. So now you have a substructure of leadership. So in terms of developing a great nation, you have the progress of redemption giving you a system of communication, and now 70 elders are added as well. When they get to Kadesh Barnea, they have every desire not to have this land as theirs, and to not have God as their God, and not have Moses as their leader. So Numbers 14 is a central passage in all of the Old Testament, and certainly a pinnacle chapter in the book of Numbers, because God has been graciously and steadily leading his people, and in spite of the 10 times that they've rebelled against him, he's been leading them towards a theocracy in the promised land where he would dwell among his people and be their God. And what you have in mind here, what God has in mind here, is what we call the millennial reign of Christ. So his intent was that he would take them, give them the law, which they all agreed to keep, which is unfortunate because nobody can keep the law. But he's taking them towards the promised land. But in chapter 14, if you'll turn there, I just want to point out a few things here. Chapter 14, verse 2, all the children. Notice the comprehensive nature of this. All the children. All the assembly, verse 5. And verse 7, all the congregation. Verse 10, all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel. And so the problem here is that these people, all of these people, says we are not going to go into this land. Two of the spies that they sent in, verse 6, Joshua and Caleb, they said God can give this to us even though there's giants. God's with us. There's not going to be a problem. But all of the congregation rejected the report and rebelled against God. They did not want God. They did not want the promised land. And so God's going to kill them and start over with Moses. And Moses pleads with God not to do that. Verse 15, now if you kill these people as one man, then the nations which have heard of your fame will speak, saying, God's not able to do what he said he was going to do. So, he argues, Lord, you're long-suffering and adamant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, verse 18. So he prays and asks God, pardon the iniquity of this people, I pray. Now, I want you to especially pay attention here. Look at verse 20 and 21. Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word. But truly, as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. So what God had in mind with Israel going into the promised land was that from Israel, through Israel, the whole earth would be filled with his glory. But these people rejected it, because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to test now these 10 times, have not heeded my voice. So at this point, he says all of those, other than Caleb and Joshua, who are 20 years old, they're going to die in the wilderness, 20 and older. From 20 years old and above, they're all going to die. And the children are going to be the only ones to go in. And so they're going to wander in the wilderness, verse 33, 40 years and bear the brunt of their sin, and he's going to kill them off. and that 40 years actually starts from the leaving of Egypt. It includes the wanderings of Mount Sinai. The numbers are best fit into it that way. And so also then those who brought the evil report, they all died in a plague before the Lord. So this is a classic chapter. It's very important to recognize that God's determined goal for this earth is that the whole earth would be filled with His glory through Israel, who would believe and walk with Him in newness of life by faith, redeemed through a blood atonement, not by works, not by trying to keep laws, but they wanted nothing to do with this. Now, in chapter 15, it's really interesting that you begin to get information about the free will offerings right after this rebellion and the judgment pronounced they would all die in the wilderness. And you go into this free will offering section, miscellaneous laws concerning offerings. And the reason that's here is because, again, the purpose of this book is to say that God is going to have the whole earth filled with His glory with willing participants. And this is a rebellious group that He's got. And down to, in the last part of chapter 15, some guys disobeying the Sabbath. I mean, this is probably a wood seller, but he's commanded to be stoned. So you've got this high-handed rejection, rebellion by God's people of His leadership, but nevertheless, His predetermined plan is going to take place. Also in this section is Korah's rebellion. That's chapter 16. That's a great passage. There's four of them: Korah, Dathan, Aviram, and On, and they're all related to each other. And they get this whole rebellion. So they've already had the sentence of death put on them, and they're going to wander for 40 years. So this is kind of an end run in futility. But they go and they get 250 leaders from the congregation, representatives of the congregation. These are men of renown. And they say, Moses, you work too hard. You take too much authority on yourself. Boy, is that classic rebellion. Yeah, you're working too hard. You need to give over some authority. I don't care if God gave you that authority or not. You should give it to us. So there's this test about the censors, and there's a confrontation, and so there's these 250. They're sent to come to the tabernacle. They are not even going to come up. And so this is where you have the earth opening up and swallowing the congregation, these sons of Korah. Interesting, there's only three of them that are named in verse 24, Korah, Dathan, Aviram. Apparently On had a change of mind. And it's interesting also to me that Korah, if you look in the lineage, he had children who did not follow him in his sin because they weren't swallowed up in the earth. They separated themselves from dad and mom and the tent that they were raised in, went someplace else while God destroyed the family. And one of the cool parts about this section is the 250 who wouldn't come up. There's fire that comes out from the Lord, from the tabernacle, and it's man, this is the stuff movies are made of, and it seeks out each of these 250 leaders, finds them in their tent and kills them. So this object lesson's great. You see this slow moving pocket of fire going through the camp, finding the tent, going into the tent, and killing these guys. And then again, God wants to destroy the whole bunch of them, and Moses intercedes. But he kills off a whole bunch of people in the plague, 14,700, besides those who died in the incident of Korah. So they're all going to die in the wilderness anyway. This just kind of makes a really cool study in how rebels and rebellion starts and the end of it. Interesting passage showing the futility of these folks in the wilderness. New Testament picks it up, and you have bodies in the wilderness. It's just the numbers of people dying is unbelievable. All right, so we don't have time to get into the red heifer sacrifice, but in chapter 20 there's the sin of Moses. This comes near the end of the 40 years. We're up, and this is the rock that he had spoken to, that he had struck previously in chapter 20. So Moses is coming in near the end of the 40 years, and his sin was that he failed to follow the Lord's instruction and failed to make a distinction between himself and the Lord. But this area, I believe, is actually on the east side of the Sinai Peninsula, where this rock is. They came here first. In verse 13, this was the water of Meribah, and we find that in Exodus 17, verse 7. But Moses' sin was that in his anger he was just not distinguishing himself from God, and he took God's responsibilities as his own, and the result of that was that he was not allowed to go into the promised land, although he did make it into the promised land on the Mount of Transfiguration. I think personally he'll come back as one of the two witnesses. The teacher of righteousness is the marginal reading in Joel 2. So the other witness is Elijah, but he didn't get to go in. Somebody else was going to take them into the promised land. So it's a good reminder to us that the work is the Lord's. It's not my church. It's not your church. It's the Lord's church, and our job is to be servants and submissive and honor Him in everything we do. All right, in the chapters 20 through 21, you have the trip from Kadesh to the plains of Moab, and then on the plains of Moab, there's a clear description here in chapters 22 through 24 of the Balaam-Balak oracles. Now this plays a really interesting role in the book. God will not alter his plans for Israel. Balaam is a true prophet who's got a moral bent, so he's an evil true prophet. He's famous in Persian circles, as well as are the wise men. He lived up in Mosul, Nineveh, and he came down to work with Balak, who was king of Moab, and he has these visions that take you all the way from the plains of Moab to the millennium. And so you get these just incredible prophecies by this evil apostate prophet when he goes under his trance, and he's quite the player, this guy. But he names guys like King Agag, who was, I'm in chapter 24, verse 7. Agag didn't come around till 400 years later. You got this incredible prophecy concerning Christ in verse 17 of the same chapter. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel and batter it's a duel, the brow with both sides of Moab, and destroy all the sons of defiance. And then prophecies concerning Edom and Seir, which is Jordan. And while Israel does valiantly, it has strength. Out of Jacob one shall come and have dominion, and destroy, utterly destroy. It's a Hebrew tense that's in form that's intensive, and utterly destroy the remains of the city. So you have these prophecies, and one of the prophecies includes a view of Israel dwelling in Jerusalem on this incredible mountain, the high mountain that will be over all of the other mountains in the world at that time. And this is just Balaam Balak, the incredible prophecies here concerning even Assyria coming. It's well worth the time studying. But the point here is that God is not going to alter His plans for Israel. He's declared that's what's going to happen, and it's just that's how it is going to be. Another passage that's really cool is the brass serpent in Numbers 21, where God punishes them and sends them fiery serpents. This is on the plains of Moab, and I've actually been to this spot, and the Jews have erected a lookout point with a serpent on a brass serpent on a pole. It's kind of cool. And from there, you can actually see Mount Nebo, where Moses was buried, where Moses died. And so when you look at Numbers 21, they're being bitten by fiery serpents, and it's a great illustration of salvation. All they had to do was look. Look is a synonym in New Testament for believe. It's easy. Tell a kid, don't look. What do? They look, because looking is easy. And so all they had to do was look at the serpent on the pole. And the way the Israelite camp was laid out, that meant they was all in aisles, very orderly. So they never had to crawl far in order to look down the aisle and see the brass serpent, and then they'd be healed. That was very, very easy. And of course, this is a great illustration. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And whoever looks or whoever believes in him receives a gift of everlasting life. So on the plains of Moab, the last section, chapters 22 through 36, you have this amazing Balaam Balak oracles, and you have information that's necessary for Israel in the millennium. So they're now in the process of learning life lessons for what they will need when they actually enter into the world's future coming millennial kingdom. So when you look at this whole section of this book, its purpose is to trace God's plan for Israel and its future, since His goal was to take them to the promised land and set up a theocracy. And He's building everything they need, including things like a system of communication and added administrative rule and a determination that His plan would not alter or change. They refused. So this whole millennial situation is now delayed until Israel believes. So enjoy the book of Numbers. It's a lot of fun. My love to you all. Bye-bye.